The Academy Days, Part 4. The Seagull fighters were smaller than Wyatt had expected. He stood on the hangar deck with the rest of the flight squad, 7 novices in a loose line, and looked at the row of fighters arranged on the launch rails with the careful spacing of expensive things that the Academy didn't want scratched. The Seagull-class interceptor was the Academy's training fighter, a real machine, not a simulation, with real engines, real weapons, and real consequences for any pilot who got careless. 2 missiles, 1 coil gun, weak shields, and an engine that the instructors described as responsive, and that the third-year novices on their way out to their first postings described, more accurately, simply as better than nothing. 2 years of sporadic simulation training exercises and a few real examples in controlled runs, nothing more than running laps on a determined track outside the large station. 2 years of screens, fake cockpits, watching recordings and others make their runs while he was sidestepped, and scores that could be voided by a malfunctioning alarm. Today, for the first time, he would fly something real on a predetermined mission to test pilots with the added threat of real consequences. Wyatt didn't let the anticipation show. He had learned, over 9 years and countless lessons that had nothing to do with flying, that overtly showing what you felt was the same as handing someone a weapon that could be used against you eventually. But the anticipation was there, settled deep in his chest like an engine warming up, and he let himself feel it in the privacy of his own silence. The hangar smelled different from the rest of the Academy. Less recycled air, more metal and fuel compound, and the faint chemical sharpness of shield emitters on standby. It smelled like purpose, like the thing he had come here to do. The briefing room adjoined the hangar, a functional space with a holographic display at the front and rows of seats that didn't distinguish between nobles and commoners, for the simple reason that the room was too small to allow for such distinctions. Wyatt took a seat at the back, as he always did. Then he noticed Petra Dainton sitting 3 seats to his left. They hadn't spoken since the night she'd come to his dormitory after the Drazen test, and the distance between them had settled into something that wasn't hostility or awkwardness, but simply the mutual agreement of 2 people who had reached an understanding without either of them needing to revisit it. Aldwin Mercer walked in last, because Aldwin Mercer always made sure to have others wait for him. The silver and green crest of House Mercer caught the hangar lights through the open door, and his stride carried the particular confidence of someone who still believed he was exceptional for passing every measure set by in the Academy. As a noble, he was superior to any commoner. That much was true, but he wasn't anywhere near the skill level he believed himself to be at. It was the baseline way of thinking for Blue Bloods, after all. He'd grown taller since the first year, broader in the shoulders, something he used to carry himself around proudly, and his gray, cybernetic eyes had been upgraded to mid-high grade, a gift from his father for completing his 2nd year. They were sharper than the old ones. His flying, unfortunately, had not kept pace with his optics. But Mercer was the mission leader. The assignment had been posted that morning, a training sortie against pirate drone formations in the Hessic Asteroid Corridor, a mapped and monitored asteroid field close to the Academy station used for practical tests and mock battles. It was close enough that rescue shuttles could reach them in minutes if anything went wrong. Precautions had been taken, of course, and while deaths were very rare, the danger remained. Real fighters, real space, simulated enemies. The mission leader had been selected by class standing, and class standing was determined by a formula that weighted examination scores, instructor evaluations, and the ever-present invisible combat of bloodline and connections that ensured a noble would always outrank a commoner, leaving the coveted leadership role to those who truly deserved it. Nobles lead. Commoners obey. It was as simple as that.
You can watch the next chapter of Academy Days right now on Vox 9. The same goes for all the Black Ship main and side stories. Just click the link in the pinned comment under this video. It goes straight to part 5 of Academy Days, so you can continue to listen. See you over there. Now back to the story.
Mercer took his position at the holographic display with the easy authority of someone who had never been given a reason to doubt his right to stand there. He activated the display, and the Hessic corridor materialized in pale blue light, a winding channel through a dense asteroid field marked with waypoints, threat zones, and the predicted positions of the drone formations they would be engaging. "The mission is straightforward," Mercer began, his voice carrying clipped certainty. A certainty used by instructors and teachers, now adopted as his own. We enter the corridor at waypoint Alpha in standard diamond formation. Advance through the corridor at regulation speed. Engage the drone formations at the prescribed distances using approved tactics. Clear each threat zone in sequence. Exit at waypoint Omega. Questions? There were no questions. There never were when a noble briefed. Questions implied that the plan had gaps, and implying that a noble's plan had gaps was the kind of career decision that commoners learned to avoid early, and nobles never had to consider. Wyatt studied the display in silence. The plan was textbook. Clean lines, prescribed distances, approved engagement patterns. It would work beautifully if the drone formations behaved exactly the way the briefing assumed they would, which they wouldn't, because training drones, simple as they were programmed to adapt. To a real pilot, they would be slow, sluggish, and respond like any machine would, with predictable patterns and countermeasures. But for most novice pilots, they were still formidable and dangerous opponents. It was made worse as the whole point of the exercise was to test how the squad responded when the textbook stopped being useful. He cataloged the problems without expression. The diamond formation was too rigid for the corridor's winding geometry. They'd lose cohesion on the first tight turn. The prescribed engagement distances assumed clear firing arcs that the asteroid field wouldn't provide. And the sequential approach to the threat zones meant they'd be hitting each formation head-on, which was exactly what the drones would expect, since that was what the doctrine said to do. He said nothing as the briefing came to a close. His fellow novices filed out toward the hangar, some showing worry and others eager to start. Wyatt was halfway to his assigned seagull when he heard an odd sound. A clatter of metal on deck plating, followed by a burst of laughter that carried the particular cruelty of people enjoying someone else's misfortune. A sound he was familiar with. In the corridor that connected the briefing room to the hangar, a Yakanti was on their hands and knees, gathering scattered cleaning implements from the deck. A mop, a bucket, several containers of cleaning solution, all of it spilt across the floor in a pattern that suggested it hadn't fallen by accident. Of course, it wasn't by accident, as he gazed upon 3 commoner crewmen, enlisted maintenance staff, not novices, who stood nearby, still laughing. One of them had his boot resting on the mop handle, pinning it to the deck while the Yakanti reached for it. Commoners, not nobles, Wyatt noted whilst a short-lived void formed in his stomach. Cruelty, be it great or petty, wasn't a fixed river running downstream. Every commoner was equally capable of it as any blue blood. It was good being reminded, not for the first time, that the river flowed in every direction. It also reminded him of Mr. Warlow's beautiful paintings of unknown sunsets and landscapes, that it wasn't the only existing river. The void in his stomach disappeared as he turned and walked over to the scene. The 3 crewmen saw him coming, and their laughter faded, not from guilt, but from the mild uncertainty of enlisted men confronted by a novice who might or might not outrank them, depending on the specifics of academy regulations that nobody fully understood. Wyatt didn't address them. They were beneath his notice. He bent down, picked up 2 of the cleaning containers, and set them back in the Yakanti's bucket. Then he lifted the mop, the crewman moved his boot without being asked, which was wise, and handed it over to the alien. The Yakanti looked up at him, small, feathered, with a rapid eye blink sequence that Wyatt had come to recognize as their species equivalent of surprise. "Thank you," they said in accented but clear common Astorish, spat out by its cheap translator. "Is not necessary." "It's done," Wyatt said simply, turning to see the 3 crewmen, but found they were already moving away. Satisfied with the result, he turned to leave, then paused as he looked up and down the Yakanti, dressed in a simple maintenance crew garb. A moment later, the question came out before he'd fully decided to ask it. "You know you could apply for transfer back to the hierarchy, right? Wouldn't have to deal with this." The Yakanti's beak opened, then closed, then opened again in what Wyatt was fairly certain was amusement. "What you see happen?" They gestured at the scattered supplies and the retreating crewmen. "Is pleasant. Is kind, compared. In the hierarchy, I am nothing. Less than nothing. I go for a swim first, then return there. This better. Much better." Wyatt knew enough about Yakanti biology to understand what that meant. Water was death for most of them. Going for a swim wasn't a figure of speech, a morbid certainty. He nodded once, said nothing more, and walked back toward the hangar. The Yakanti resumed collecting their supplies, and the corridor returned to its usual indifference. A small moment. A brief exchange with someone whose name he hadn't asked and wouldn't remember. But something about it, the casual acceptance of a life that was terrible by any measure, and still better than the alternative, settled into a quiet corner of his mind alongside the ledger and the mask and all the other things he carried through this academy without showing. In the hangar, the seagulls waited on their launch rails. Wyatt climbed into his cockpit, ran his hands across the reel controls for the first time, and felt the engine hum through the airframe and into his bones. Real fighters. Real space. and a mission plan that was going to fall apart the moment they entered that corridor. He strapped in and waited for the launch order. The Seagull was launched like a fist. Wyatt had expected something gradual, similar to the smooth takeoffs he'd done in previous tests, an acceleration curve, a build-up, or the polite escalation of a simulation easing you into the experience. What he got instead was a rail launch that slammed him back into his seat with a force that no simulator had ever bothered to replicate, and that his body was entirely unprepared for. Never before had he been more grateful for the kinetic dampeners than at that moment. In mere moments, the Academy station shrank to a point of light behind him, and then there was nothing but void, stars, and the gut-dropping realization that the space between him and death was now measured in millimeters of hull plating rather than the comfortable fiction of a screen. Real. This is real. I'm in space. I'm in space! Wyatt thought as an indescribable joy coursed through his body. His hands found the controls, and the Seagull responded, not like in the simulations, which always carried a faint lag of a system translating intention into output. He didn't know if all simulators were like that or if the Academy used the cheap ones, though he suspected the answer was the latter. It didn't matter as the results were immediate, with a raw, twitching sensitivity that made the fighter feel less like a machine and more like an extension of his body. The engine vibration hummed through the frame and into his bones. It was always a great, foreign sensation that felt so right. The coil gun's power indicator glowed a steady amber on his left display. 2 missiles sat in their cradles waiting. Beautiful. Terrifying, but mostly beautiful. All fighters form on me. Diamond pattern, standard spacing. Waypoint Alpha in 90 seconds. Mercer's voice came through the comms with the clipped authority of a boy who had been told his entire life that command was his birthright and had never encountered evidence to the contrary. Wyatt slotted into his assigned position, rear left of the diamond, the trailing slot that doctrine designated as the formation's rear guard. It was the position given to the pilot that the leader trusted least or was deemed expendable, which was to say a commoner. But that suited him just right. The rear of the formation was where the view was best, and the oversight was worst, and Wyatt had long since learned that the places blue bloods didn't want to look were the places where the useful information lived. The squad fell into formation. 8 Seagulls, arrayed in Mercer's prescribed diamond formation, burning toward the Hessic asteroid corridor at regulation speed. It wasn't a standard squadron formation employed by the Royal Navy, but it was what was expected for a regular patrol run. Petra Dainton was 2 positions ahead, flying with the quiet precision that made her invisible to instructors and invaluable to anyone paying attention. The other novices, 3 nobles and 2 commoners, held their positions carefully, showcasing the rigidity of nervous pilots and were concentrating too hard on controlling their vessels and checking readings to talk. The asteroid corridor opened ahead of them like a mouth, dense, tumbling, littered with rocks ranging from pebble-sized debris to chunks large enough to hide a frigate behind. The corridor wound through the field in a mapped path that the Academy's navigators had charted and certified as safe within operational parameters, which Wyatt translated as safe enough that they probably won't have to write too many letters to parents if something went wrong. Entering the corridor. Maintain formation. Maintain speed? Engage targets at prescribed distances on my mark. Mercer's voice was steady, confident. The plan was working because nothing had happened yet, and nothing happening was the only condition under which the plan could work. The first drone formation appeared at the far end of the corridor's opening stretch. 6 contacts, spread in a loose screen across the passage, moving toward them at moderate speed. Training drones programmed to simulate pirate interceptors. They wouldn't fly like Drazen. They'd fly like humans devoid of the very concepts of honor and dignified tradition. Designated criminals who didn't follow rules, which was a different kind of dangerous and, in Wyatt's opinion, a more honest representation of what they'd actually face in service. Mercer's orders came through. Targets sighted. All fighters hold formation. We engage at 4,000 meters on my command. 4,000 meters. Wyatt watched the range counter tick down. The drones were already adjusting, their formation shifting from the loose screen into something tighter, more aggressive. At 3,800 meters, 2 of them broke away from the main group and began angling toward the squad's flanks. Wyatt saw it immediately. The drones were splitting, 4 coming head-on to hold their attention while 2 swept wide through the asteroid cover to hit them from the sides. It was a basic but effective tactic, and the diamond formation's rigid geometry was about to make it work perfectly. Targets at 4,000. All fighters, engage on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark! The squad opened fire. Coil gun rounds streaked down the corridor toward the 4 head-on drones, and the void lit up with the exchange. 2 drones took hits and peeled away, damaged but functional. The other 2 juked hard, splitting apart, and suddenly the neat engagement that Mercer had planned became considerably more chaotic. "Maintain formation! Stay on target!" Mercer's voice climbed half an octave. The confidence was still there, but it had acquired a companion. The first thin note of a man realizing that the textbook chapter he'd memorized didn't have a section on what to do when the enemy didn't cooperate. Then the 2 flanking drones hit. They came in from the port side, screaming out of the asteroid cover at an angle that the Diamond Formation's sensor coverage didn't adequately protect, because it assumed threats would come from the front. Coil gun rounds raked across the squad's left flank. One novice, a noble whose name Wyatt thought was Hargrove, took a direct hit to his shield array. The shields held, barely, but the impact mixed with his panic threw his seagull into a lateral spin that took him out of formation and sent him tumbling toward an asteroid that he avoided by what looked, from Wyatt's position, like approximately 2 meters and a great deal of luck. "I'm hit! Shield's critical! Hargrove, get back in formation," Mercer barked. "All fighters, maintain the diamond!" "Maintain—" The second flanking drone made its pass. Another novice took fire, this time on the starboard side. The Diamond Formation, already fractured by the first hit, shuddered and began to come apart as pilots broke in different directions to evade incoming rounds that the formation's rigid geometry was funneling directly into them. "Oh, this is going wonderfully. Truly a masterclass in tactical leadership." Perhaps Lord Mercer would like to announce our exact position and heading next, in case any of the drones missed us, Wyatt thought, as he broke from his own position to avoid a burst that stitched the space where his tail had been half a second earlier. The comms dissolved into overlapping voices, calls for coherent orders, damage reports. One novice swearing in a dialect that suggested the Academy hadn't entirely succeeded in civilizing him. Mercer was still issuing commands, but the commands were variations on maintain formation, a formation that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The squad had scattered across the corridor, individual seagulls dodging between asteroids and drone fire in a chaos that bore no resemblance to anything in any briefing room. Wyatt pulled his seagull behind a tumbling rock and cut his engines. The asteroid's mass masked his signature, giving him precious seconds of quiet in the middle of the noise. He used them. 6 drones, 2 damaged from the opening exchange but still active, 4 fully operational. 8 seagulls, 1 with critical shields, the rest intact but scattered and leaderless in everything but name. The corridor ahead narrowed, the asteroids grew denser, the gaps tighter. A funneling tunnel. If the squad continued like this, flying individually, reacting rather than acting, the drones would pick them apart one at a time in the narrow sections. But the narrow sections were also the drones' weakness. Tighter corridors meant fewer approach angles. Fewer approach angles meant the drones' flanking tactics became less effective. And if someone who had spent 2 years learning to fly in spaces that the doctrines said were too tight to fly in, led the squad through the narrows in a formation that used the asteroid cover rather than ignoring it, the drones would be forced into head-on engagements where the squad's numbers gave them the advantage. He had the solution. The problem was that the solution required Mercer to listen, and Mercer was currently shouting, "Regroup," into a comms channel that had stopped listening to him 30 seconds ago. Wyatt opened a private channel, his voice calm and appropriately submissive and deferential. "Lord Mercer." A pause. Heavy breathing. "Staples, get back in formation." "There is no formation, Lord Mercer." "But there can be." He kept his voice level and respectful, in the practiced tone of a commoner offering a suggestion rather than issuing a correction. The corridor narrows ahead. The rocks get denser. If you lead the squad into the narrows in a staggered column, single file, using the asteroids as cover, the drones can't flank us. They'll be forced to come at us head-on, 1 or 2 at a time. We can then pick them off in sequence. Silence on the channel. Wyatt could hear Mercer breathing, could practically hear the gears turning behind those upgraded gray cybernetics as the boy weighed the humiliation of taking a commoner's advice against the humiliation of losing the mission entirely. "All right, just 1 more push," Wyatt thought, determined. "I feel terribly dumb for saying such a thing, Lord Mercer." "I'm sure you already thought of it, and I simply ended up echoing your plans, Lord Mercer," he added. "Your decision. Your mission. We depend on your orders as our leader." "Your order. Your credit." That was the unspoken translation, and they both knew it. Another second of silence. Then Mercer's voice returned, not the panicked voice demanding order where there was none, but one filled with certainty. All fighters, new formation. Staggered column, single file. Form on me. We're taking the Narrows, the squad responded. Not instantly, not with the crisp obedience of a well-drilled unit, but with the ragged relief of people who had been waiting for someone to say something that made sense. Seagulls peeled out of their scattered positions and fell into line behind Mercer's fighter, one after another, threading into the narrowing corridor like beads on a string. Wyatt took the rearguard position. Naturally, the Narrows were everything he'd predicted. The asteroids closed in, reducing the corridor to a winding channel barely wide enough for 2 fighters abreast. The drones followed, but their options had collapsed. The flanking runs that had torn their previous formation apart were impossible in here. They came head-on, one at a time, and the squad met them with concentrated sequence fire from the front of the column while the trailing pilots covered the rear. The first drone came around a bend and flew straight into Mercer's coil gun burst. The shot was clean, but Mercer was not. Despite Wyatt's many private observations about his abilities, a terrible pilot when the situation was simple enough. The drone went red. A second drone followed, caught in a crossfire between Mercer and Petra. Kill confirmed! The remaining 4 drones pressed in, but the Narrows had turned the engagement from chaos into a shooting gallery. The squad picked them apart methodically, one by one, the staggered column giving each pilot a clear firing arc, while the asteroid walls prevented the drones from doing anything clever. Wyatt took the last one himself. It had tried to loop back through a gap in the asteroids to hit the column from behind, the rear position, the one nobody wanted, and Wyatt was waiting for it. He'd been watching for exactly that move since they entered the Narrows, because it was what he would have done, and the drones were programmed to act like pilots who didn't follow rules. One burst. Clean kill. The drone's contact flickered and died on his display. All targets eliminated, Wyatt reported, his voice flat and professional. Corridor clear. A moment of silence on the comms. Then, Mercer's voice came next, not shaking while he was already constructing the version of events he would tell afterwards. Good work, all fighters. Mission complete. Form up for return to base. Wyatt fell into formation. His hands were steady on the controls. The Seagull hummed beneath him, responsive and alive, and for a few seconds before the return flight and the debrief and the inevitable reshaping of what had actually happened, he let himself feel it. 4 fighters suffered minor damage, but their pilots were still breathing. He had flown a real fighter, in real space, and it had been everything he'd come to this academy for. The rest was just politics. The debrief was held in the same briefing room where Mercer had outlined his plan 3 hours earlier. The holographic display now showed the mission replay. 8 Seagull icons tracing their paths through the Hessek corridor, the drone contacts appearing, the engagement unfolding in clean, color-coded lines that made the whole thing look considerably more orderly than it had felt from inside a cockpit. Flight instructor Aldrich Beaumont Hale presided. He sat at the front of the room, his hands clasped on the table and his dull silver eyes fixed on the display, with the particular attention of a man searching for something to punish. 2 other instructors flanked him, their expressions conveying the neutral professionalism of officers there to assess rather than settle personal scores. Mercer stood at the display and delivered his after-action report with the polished confidence of a boy who had spent the flight back to the station rehearsing every word. Upon entering the corridor, I ordered the squad into diamond formation as briefed. Initial engagement proceeded as planned, with the lead elements engaging the drone screen at the prescribed distance. When the enemy executed a flanking maneuver that compromised the formation's integrity, I reassessed the tactical situation and made the decision to transition to a staggered column formation, utilizing the narrowing asteroid corridor to neutralize the enemy's flanking capability. The adjusted formation channeled the engagement into a series of head-on contacts where our numerical advantage proved decisive. All 6 drones were eliminated. No friendly losses sustained. It was, Wyatt had to admit, a competent summary. Every fact was accurate. Every tactical decision was attributed to Mercer. The word "I" appeared with the frequency of a heartbeat, and the word "staples" did not appear at all. The transition from the diamond formation to a staggered column, the moment that had saved the mission, was presented as Mercer's reassessment, Mercer's decision, Mercer's tactical innovation under pressure. Well, of course it was. What else would it be? A commoner's idea? Don't be absurd, Lord Mercer. Commoners don't have ideas. They have positions at the back of the formation and the privilege of being permitted to fly, Wyatt thought, and was mildly surprised to find that the thought carried no bitterness at all. Just the dry, familiar amusement of a boy who had stopped expecting the system to be fair somewhere around the 3rd week of his first year. Probably much earlier than that back home. The instructors asked questions. Mercer answered them with assured fluency. Beaumont Hale's eyes lingered on the section of the replay where the diamond formation collapsed. The section where, if you knew what to look for, you could see a single seagull icon pull behind an asteroid coming to a halt for nearly half a minute, and then a private comm channel opened between the rear position and the lead. But he said nothing. The replay data showed what happened. It did not show who suggested it, and comms logs for private channels were not included in standard debrief packages. Convenient that, he thought with amusement. Excellent tactical adaptation, Novice Mercer, one of the flanking instructors said, making a note on his datapad. The transition to column formation in the Narrows showed genuine situational awareness within acceptable Royal Navy doctrine parameters. Commendable. Mercer accepted the praise with a nod that conveyed both humility and the absolute certainty that it was deserved. It was a skill, Wyatt reflected. A blue blood skill taught from birth. The art of receiving credit for things you hadn't done with an expression that made everyone in the room feel good about giving it to you. Flight score 91. Highest in the exercise group. Well done, Novice Mercer, said the second instructor. 91? Mercer's face betrayed a flicker of genuine pleasure. Not the performed satisfaction of a noble accepting his due, but the real thing, brief and quickly buried. He had wanted a high score, at least an 80. He had wanted to be the best, and an 80 was a good stepping stone. Solid, ambitious, and respectable. But a 91... The system had given him a score that would be talked over for weeks to come, and for one unguarded moment, the boy underneath the crest had been happy about it. Wyatt watched that flicker and felt nothing. Not resentment. Not envy. Not the slow burn of injustice that he had expected to feel, and that some part of him thought he probably should feel. Just the mild, detached observation of a transaction completed. He had traded an idea for a completed mission. The mission was completed without significant losses. A bargain price was paid in exchange. That was all that mattered. The debrief concluded. The novices filed out. Wyatt was halfway to the corridor when Mercer fell into step beside him, which was unusual enough to register as a minor event. They walked in silence for several paces. Mercer's stride was longer, his posture carrying a residual sense of pride at achieving a goal far beyond his plans. Wyatt's stride was the same as always, measured, unhurried, attracting nothing. "You're not angry," Mercer said eventually. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation filled with genuine confusion. Wyatt glanced at him. "Should I be, Lord Mercer? I took your—" Mercer stopped himself. Reconsidered. Started again. The column formation. The Narrows. That was... He trailed off, his jaw working in a way that suggested the next word was causing him physical difficulty. "That wasn't in the briefing." Wyatt's expression didn't change. "No, Lord Mercer. It wasn't. And you're not angry," Mercer repeated, as though saying it twice might change the answer. "You led the mission," Wyatt said. His voice was even, carrying the same respectful neutrality he used with every noble. But for once, and this surprised him more than it should have, it wasn't entirely a mask. "The squad followed your orders. The mission was completed. The score is yours." He meant it. That was the strange part. He meant it completely, without sarcasm, without the buried resentment that he kept in the ledger alongside every other cost this academy had extracted from him. The mission had faced a real problem. The problem was solved. Wyatt had flown a real fighter through a real asteroid corridor and put a real coil gun burst through a real drone, and the memory of how that had felt, the seagull responding to his hands, the void opening around him, the clean, satisfying sensation of a kill, was worth more than any score on any instructor's datapad. Credit is a blue blood's currency. I care for different things, thought Wyatt, relaxing his posture slightly. Mercer stared at him. The gray, cybernetic eyes, sharper now than the mid-grade optics he'd worn in his first year, searched Wyatt's face with an intensity that suggested he was looking for the lie, the hidden anger, the crack in the commoner's composure that would confirm everything he'd been taught about how the world worked. He didn't find any of it. Something shifted behind those eyes. Not respect, that word was too large, too generous for what passed between a third son of a minor baron and a simple commoner from a mere colony world in a corridor that smelled of recycled air and fuel compound. But it was something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood and occasionally nodded to it across the street. The recognition, perhaps, that the boy walking beside him was not playing the same game he was, and that this made him not lesser but simply incomprehensible. "You're a strange one, Staples. Almost paradoxical," Mercer said. It was the closest thing to a compliment that Aldwin Mercer had ever given him. and quite possibly the closest thing to a compliment that Aldwin Mercer was capable of giving anyone. "The first one I've been told before, Lord Mercer." "The second one is new," Wyatt replied simply, returning his attention to the hallway. They reached the junction where the noble quarters branched left and the commoner dormitories continued straight ahead. Mercer stopped. Wyatt didn't. He kept walking, his pace unchanged, his expression unchanged, his hands at his sides in the same regulation position they always occupied. "Staples," Wyatt paused. Half-turned. Mercer stood at the junction, the silver and green crest of House Mercer catching the corridor light in the way it always did. His expression had settled back into its default, the practiced ease of a noble who knew his place in the order of things and was comfortable there. But his voice, when he spoke, carried something that hadn't been there before, something quieter. There was a moment of hesitation, but it passed in the blink of an eye. "Good flying today." Then he turned left and was gone. Wyatt stood in the corridor for a moment. He considered the words. "Good flying today." 3 words spoken by a boy who had spent 2 years making sure that Wyatt knew, at every opportunity, that a commoner's place was beneath him. 3 words that cost Mercer nothing to say, and yet, from the way he'd said them, quickly, almost reluctantly, as though they'd escaped before he could stop them, had cost him something, after all. Wyatt filed it, not in the ledger. The ledger was for costs and slights and the cold arithmetic of survival. This went somewhere else, somewhere he didn't have a name for, alongside the Icanti, who would rather drown than go back to the hierarchy, and the Royal Marine, who fought the way that ended fights, and the memory of a seagull responding to his hands in real space for the first time in real combat. He started walking again. The commoner dormitory was ahead. The corridor was empty. His footsteps were steady and unhurried. Petra Dainton was leaning against the wall outside the bunk room. Not like a noble would do. She'd never lean like that. But with the quiet, contained stillness of someone who had been waiting without wanting to be seen waiting. She looked at him as he approached. Her expression carried no question, no expectation. Just acknowledgement. She'd been in that corridor. She'd heard the private channel. She'd seen the debrief. She knew exactly what had happened, exactly what Wyatt had traded, and exactly what Mercer had taken. She didn't say a word. She simply nodded, one small, precise movement, and walked past him into the bunk room. Wyatt watched her go. The door closed. The corridor was silent. He'd told her months ago that surviving this place and surviving it alone were the same thing. He still believed that. He had to believe that. But the nod, brief, wordless, asking nothing and offering nothing except the simple fact of having been seen, settled into the same unnamed place where he'd filed Mercer's 3 words. He went inside, sat on his bunk, and stared at the ceiling. The scratched metal offered nothing, as it always did. Somewhere in the Academy's administrative systems, Aldwin Mercer's score of 91 was being logged alongside a commendation for correct and innovative tactical application, and Wyatt Staples' contribution was being filed under the same vast, comfortable silence that swallowed everything a commoner did that the system couldn't accommodate. The mission was complete. The problem was solved. The credit belonged to someone else. He didn't care about the latter. Wyatt closed his eyes. He dreamed of a seagull's cockpit. The void, stars, and the way a real engine felt when it answered to your hands. But above all, victory had been achieved. It more than sufficed.
You can watch the next chapter of Academy Days right now on Vox 9. The same goes for all the Black Ship main and side stories. Just click the link in the pinned comment under this video. It goes straight to part 5 of Academy Days so you can continue to listen. See you over there. Now back to the story.